quiet of a New England college town is shattered when two professors are murdered in their home.
The story of what happened there.
The investigation targets angry students, vengeful associates, even killers who strike at random.
They cut the phone lines. I guess ratcheted this whole thing up a couple of more levels.
The murder weapon holds the key to the crime.
We're looking for smoking gun.
But can a nationwide manhunt catch the killer? Hanover is home to Dartmouth College, a prestigious Ivy League university. Professor Roxana Verona arrives at a colleague's house for a weekly dinner get-together. Her 911 call brings Lieutenant James White to the secluded home on the outskirts of town.
I was the officer in charge of crime scene processing for that investigation. The house sits well off the road, so when I arrived, it was difficult to see from the road. There was a handover officer there, just ensuring that nobody go into the house. Obviously, a very high-end home, very nicely appointed.
But in the study, White discovers a horror scene. A woman and man covered in blood.
We deal a lot with domestic-type homicides, so the first question was, is this a murder-suicide?
The victims are married couple, Hulf and Susanna Zantop. Both are highly respected Dartmouth professors.
It appeared that when we first got in there and got a look at the bodies that they were stab wounds. A knife had been used to kill them. There was a lot of blood pooling at the scene, so they both had bled significantly. It's unusual in a murder-suicide for a suicide victim to commit a murder with a knife and then to take his or her own life with a knife as well. There were some defensive wounds on Hal, and the chaotic nature of the room, the way the table was upended and the papers strewn about and the chairs in disarray, obviously there had been some type of violent struggle. We branched out into the other rooms to look for any sign of anybody having been through the house, to see if possibly robbery was a motive.
But the rest of the house appears undisturbed.
At that point, I noticed that in the kitchen, it appeared that a meal for two was being prepared. There was a couple of bowls and a couple of cups and a pot on the stove. Some things were being chopped for a salad.
It appears an ordinary afternoon at home somehow exploded into violence. Timothy Pfeiffer leads the team of forensic investigators.
What really caught my eye, there was a series of little pieces of wood strewn about. First responding officers had placed kindling wood on drops of blood as well as footwear impressions so as not to contaminate DNA evidence. There was one footwear impression visible on a hardwood floor leading from the foyer into the study. Maybe someone stepped in some of the blood residue that was left behind at the crime scene and transferred a pattern onto the hardwood floor.
But the footprint isn't as clear as Pfeiffer would like.
After photographing the visible footwear impression, I then applied a blood enhancement reagent called leucocrystal violet, or LCV. This blood enhancement reagent reacts with minute amounts of blood and actually enhances the footwear impression by turning it a violet color, as well as bringing up some details that maybe were not present in a visible sense.
We should get something out of that, definitely.
As police continue examining the couple's study, another clue emerges.
One of the bookshelves that we processed in the study was directly over where Hoff Zentop's head was resting, and we noticed that there was a slice taken out of that particular bookshelf where probably the weapon that was used to attack Hoff Zentop actually came in contact with that wooden shelf.
Like matching a bullet to a gun, microscopic examination of the cut could help them identify the knife used to make it.
The bookshelf was removed and brought back to the forensic laboratory.
Detective Charles West of the New Hampshire State Police joins the investigation.
The first 24 and then the next 48 hours are the most critical. That's why you throw as much as you can at these investigations early on to identify who did this. The longer time goes, it's more difficult to solve these cases.
Like Pfeiffer and White, West struggles to make sense of the carnage.
It certainly became clear it was going to be a difficult investigation. That was evident early on, that this isn't going to come easily.
Examination of the home's entrances tells a disturbing tale.
The front door was not locked, and there had been no type of a forced entry.
The alarming discovery suggests the Zantops invited the killer inside their house.
It was either friends, acquaintances, colleagues, students. It was likely that it was somebody who knew the Zantops.
This is a brutal homicide. We just don't know. Somebody's capable of doing this, and they're still loose out there.
The town of Hanover and Dartmouth College are still reeling from two murders of professors.
The brutal stabbings of Hulf and Susanna Zantop in New Hampshire send shockwaves through the region. Kelly Ayotte is the homicide prosecutor assigned to the case.
Who would want to do harm to these two well-liked and popular professors in their own homes? That becomes very troubling to a community.
There is no reason for there to be a panic in the public right now. The Hanover Police Department and the New Hampshire State Police are investigating this thoroughly.
At the crime scene, police can find no murder weapon. But in the turmoil of the Zantop study, they discover a critical piece of evidence, a knife sheath used to carry an extremely sharp knife. And then, remarkably,
Looks like we've got another one. Number 2.
That led me to believe that there was at least 2 attackers.
the double homicide now has a chilling new dimension. The sheaths could prove critical in tracking down whoever butchered the Zantops.
We felt that it was very likely that the sheaths belonged to the killers.
So I instructed that the knife sheaths would be packaged and sent back to the forensic laboratory for better processing.
But the possibility there is more than one killer does nothing to explain why Hulf and Susanna were targeted in the first place.
These were two well-known, well-established, the right word is loved, well-loved professors.
Charles West interviews the woman who discovered the bodies.
They were expecting me. I called my...
Professor Roxana Verona was a regular dinner guest at the Zantops. She tells the detective the couple were famous for their hospitality, popular with students and staff alike. Dr. Sujiwa Fonseca is a close friend of the Zantops and a foreign medical student at the time. The couple helped finance her education.
I did feel like a adopted child, sort of taken into the family. They love humanity, they embrace it. That's what I remember them for.
They were published, serious people in their respective fields. They are the elite of the campus.
Hulf taught in the Earth Sciences department. Susanna was chairman of the German department.
To have them dead for no reason made no sense.
Their attacker or attackers must be found. Investigators pore over the knife sheaves for clues. Each is marked with 3 letters, S-O-G.
They said SOG on them, which generally means Special Operations Group and would indicate some type of, again, Special Forces, Special Operations type knife, but did not know exactly what type of knife had been in them, but they were large, very large sheaths, so indicated that likely they contained large knives.
Police learn the sheaths were made for a very specific type of knife. Pfeiffer buys one and brings it to the lab.
It's called a Seal 2000 knife. It's manufactured by SOG. It's designed as a military or commando-style knife, pretty much to kill. Extremely heavy, very, very sharp, to the point where it's extremely dangerous to handle it even in a laboratory setting.
Pfeiffer sets out to match the Seal 2000 to the damage found at the scene.
We did a lot of documentation as far as measurements, length of the blade, the width. Something of this size and sharpness would absolutely be able to recreate that mark in the bookshelf. We're looking for a smoking gun. In this case, it happens to be to SOG Seal 2009.
The type of knife is one thing, the actual murder weapon another. The daunting challenge of tracking the purchase of sealed knives falls to Detective West.
Distribution was worldwide, so that certainly made it more complex and more difficult.
Chasing down and investigating thousands of individual buyers could prove next to impossible.
Initially, it was overwhelming, and it was compared to tracking down a can of Coke. It was that common.
Days pass with no arrest in the case. Fear spreads across the Dartmouth campus.
It was just a real horrific crime, and without having a suspect, I think it caught people's attention, and I think it really created a sense of uneasiness throughout the college community.
If they were targeted, it would be somebody they knew.
Who knew the Xantops well enough to be invited into their home, but hated them enough to plan their murder? A memorial service is held for the beloved couple. Hundreds attend.
I wanted to thank you from my sister and I, from the depths of our heart, for all the love and support that we've gotten from everyone here, as well as for the love and support that you gave my parents.
The event is filled with grief, but also tinged with suspicion.
It seemed like everybody was a suspect, including myself. I wanted to get close to all the friends that were there who were grieving, but there was no 100% as to who the murderer was. So, you might be hugging this person. How scary is that?
Well, what you're looking for is a motive. Why would somebody have done this? So you check, family members, obviously, neighbors, anyone that came in contact with the Xantops.
As the town mourns, police finally get a lead when they're tipped off to angry and alarming messages on a local internet discussion board. They're all from the same account, posted by a man named Sebastian Atsby. He's picked up for questioning.
Right, another $1 million question.
He had a specific grudge against Dartmouth College because they had fired him from his dishwashing job. But he also had this theory that the science departments at Dartmouth were cursed.
What were the reasons that you were so hostile?
The fury Atsby displayed over being fired, coupled with Hulf's connection to the science department he despised, make him a prime suspect.
He says, I think what the Hanover Police Department need to do is realize this is a double suicide and get off this silly homicide investigation. But maybe he's trying to divert attention, however clumsily, from himself and to stall the homicide investigation.
The Zantop murders were fueled by rage, something Atsby has plenty of.
You want to talk about your...
But he denies any involvement in their deaths, claiming he was at home on the internet at the time. Police contact his internet service provider. If he's lying, they'll soon know. Meanwhile, more leads surface.
This was really a whodunit case in the beginning, and some of them led to certain students, so that led the investigators to the college.
A neighbor had pointed out to the police that Hoff had been spending some extra time counseling and tutoring a student who was troubled.
I've earned it. It was all dependent on your doing the work.
Because the word troubled was thrown in the mix, perhaps they were somebody that would be a suspect.
We're looking for this young man. We understand he was...
Also, a local cab driver tells police on the night of the killings, a frantic student flagged down his taxi.
And said, look, I've got to get to the airport right now. Just keep going, go, 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 go.
This young man apparently looked very urgent to get out of town, and you know, there was a lot of public attention, so the cab driver thought, well, that was kind of suspicious.
Detective White locates and clears the troubled student.
Police looked at it and said that it was a way over-characterization of the degree to which they were troubled, and they were ruled out quickly.
The cab driver's lead also goes nowhere.
They caught up with the student, and there had actually been a family emergency. He had flown out of the area.
Students were cleared because essentially the investigators looked carefully at where they were at the time that the murders occurred and were able to see that they had a clear alibi in those cases.
Sebastian Atsby remains the most likely suspect until police hear from his internet service provider.
He was able to show that he had in fact been home, posting away like crazy at the time the homicides had occurred. So after a while, the police department began to say, okay, this is fascinating, but this is not our guy.
So as days went on, it became more evident that this is going to be a difficult case to crack open.
There was just a real kind of a doggedness that we really wanted to succeed.
Finally, almost a week after the murder, that doggedness pays off.
Upon processing the knife sheath, we recovered one fingerprint.
It's the biggest clue yet. A killer has left his calling card. A week into the murder investigation of two popular college professors, New Hampshire police have a breakthrough, a fingerprint from the crime scene.
It was then searched through the fingerprint database.
But the hope they could ID a killer is quickly dashed.
That resulted in no match.
It means police are searching for someone who's never been in trouble with the law. The forensics team now turns their attention to the boot print.
I took a photograph of that boot impression. I scanned that. I emailed that particular image to the FBI laboratory, who has a huge database of all the footwear outsole patterns from around the world. And within a day, they came back with a match, that it matched a particular manufacturer's boot. I contacted that company. They said it was a hiking boot.
Thousands of these boots have been sold, but they need just one: the murderers.
The minutia that's included in footwear impressions is extremely important. These accidental characteristics make a footwear impression unique to one particular shoe. A footwear impression containing enough accidental characteristics can be just as good as identification as a fingerprint.
Detectives have two compelling pieces of evidence, and no one to connect them to. With the search for a credible suspect growing desperate, police move quickly when one more lead emerges.
All of the rental car agencies in the 2-3 state area had been asked to keep an eye out for anything unusual in the wake of these homicides.
One agency alerts police to a vehicle returned the morning after the murders.
The car rental place realized that this car had gone from the airport to Dartmouth College.
But what makes it suspicious is the evidence discovered inside.
In the trunk is a cardboard box with a blood stain in the bottom. In the front seat is a business card from a professor from Arizona.
This professor was in town at the time that the Zantops were murdered.
A background check suggests a professional grudge against the esteemed couple.
He might have been unhappy that Half received a position at Dartmouth College that he wanted.
Could this be the professor's getaway car? Did a jealous colleague savagely attack the Zantops? And stow the bloody knives in the boot and speed away?
It was an odd situation, you know, a lot of coincidences that he was actually in town, that he, you know, we at least got information that he had wanted a position that Half got.
The murder takes place while he was in Dartmouth, and then all of a sudden, a few days later, he's gone and there's this weird stain in the back of the car.
So the police actually went to Arizona to interview him and to find out, you know, what was going on, where was he at the time of the murders.
The professor contends he was in Hanover for a friend's birthday and has a simple explanation for the bloody box in the boot.
He says, someone I've known for a long time shot a moose. They knew I was coming. They made the special pot of moose stew, took it to a party. That was what was in the cardboard box. Slopped out a little bit on the drive. That's the weird stain that looks like blood in the back of the car.
Forensic tests confirm the story. The bloody stain isn't human. It's stew. The professor is cleared. Police face yet another dead end, and a killer or killers remain on the loose. Unable to link the murders to anyone even remotely connected to the Zantops, we must now consider the frightening possibility this is a random killing. An unusual story surfaces just across the state line in Vermont, courtesy of a man named Andrew Patty. Like the Zantops, Patty owns an isolated residence. His about an hour's drive from Hanover. It's there he experienced a bizarre incident months before the killings.
There's a certain code and culture when you live in areas like this. First off, you don't knock on a man's door with your full fist and pound on it at about 10:15 at night. Don't like it. I get up, I draw my pistol, and I pull the curtain back, and right there, looking through the other side of the glass, is an individual.
The stranger claims car problems. He needs a phone to call a garage.
It looked like he was getting ready to push in. It looked like it was an attempt at robbery.
Patty sees another man behind him.
I took my pistol and I brought it up. When I raised the pistol, that was when they took off. So I walk over to the phone, pick up the phone, and guess what? It's dead. Okay, we just ratcheted this whole thing up a couple of more levels.
Patty spends a sleepless night standing guard, waiting for the two strangers to return. They never do. In the morning, he finds the telephone wires cut, confirming his instinct the visitors meant him harm. Could these be the same men who targeted the Zantops? Two weeks into the investigation, Hanover police are now convinced the vicious murder of two college professors was a random act.
If it was a stranger or strangers, then who are they and where are they now?
To answer those questions, police desperately need a break in their search for suspicious purchases of Seal 2000 knives. Luckily, the knife sheaves finally give them one.
There was a Kydex sheath, which has only been used for a limited amount of time. More importantly, the Kydex sheath on the back had the logo of SOG, and that had only been done since March of 2000. So now we have a window of March of 2000 to the date of the homicide, January 27th. It's 10 months and 27 days.
West locates a store close to Hanover that sells SOG knives with the recent issue sheaths.
The owner was able to actually produce a list of people that bought a SOG Seal 2000 after March 2000, and there was a considerable number that were sold. We looked at each purchase where that person physically lived.
One sale in particular catches his eye.
This one jumped right out at you. There's one person that bought 2 knives within 30 miles of Hanover. That certainly became a source of interest.
The buyer's name is James Parker.
Chelsea, Vermont.
He lives just across the state border in Vermont.
When we got the lead that the double purchase had been traced to Chelsea, Vermont, which is 40 miles away from Hanover, it was very surprising because this was an investigation that went all over the country.
West and his partner drive to Chelsea to investigate. But James Parker is not at all what they're expecting.
Hi, James Parker.
Surely this friendly teenager couldn't be a killer.
Once you saw that it was a 16-year-old, we just didn't know what the scenario was. He bought 2 knives, we know that.
I believe this is the knife.
Yeah.
But what did he do with them? Did he sell the knives to another person? Did he buy them for somebody else?
Parker quickly admits to buying the knives over the internet, but has an innocent explanation.
His story was that he and his friend Robert Tulloch bought the knives to build forts, to cut branches.
These knives don't do anything, man.
But they didn't like the knives, so he sold them in Burlington, Vermont at a Army and Navy store.
What began as a promising lead now looks highly unlikely.
Physically, Parker didn't look like he was capable. He's 16 years old. He looks like a typical teenage kid. So we just didn't know if a 16-year-old was capable of this kind of violence.
Do you have the boots you were using?
Still, the youth must be investigated. Parker is polite and cooperative, turning over his boots and going with West to the local sheriff's office for fingerprinting. Next, police visit his friend, Robert Tulloch.
Hi, I'm Detective West. How are you?
These were 2 typical teenage boys that were close friends, did a lot of things together. So he mirrored exactly what Parker said, that they had sold the knives in Burlington, Vermont at an Army Navy store.
As with Parker, West takes Tulloch's boots and brings him in to be fingerprinted. Like his friend, Tulloch seems an ordinary kid.
Thanks for cooperation.
There certainly wasn't any background to lead us that they were involved in any type of violence or any criminal activity at all. So we gave them the benefit of the doubt because legally there was nothing we could do at this point. That's why we left them in Chelsea, Vermont that day. We went back to the Hanover Police Department, had a great deal of discussion of their age and are they capable of doing this? Do we have the right people in terms of the people that committed the homicide? And the answer is we just didn't know. I mean, we talked amongst ourselves a great deal, so that they just didn't look like they had the grit, I think is the word that was used. Just they didn't seem that they could be capable of this.
You rocked it.
As he digs into the background of the 2 boys, West finds little to change his opinion. Chelsea is an extremely small town where everyone knows James Parker and Robert Tulloch.
These 2 boys faced a lot of the same challenges that kids growing up in a small town like this or teenagers anywhere face. They would get in scrapes from time to time, the way any teenager would, but there was nothing that stood out. because everybody sees Jimmy performing in a play. They see Robert debating. They see these kids horsing around. They see them tipping over their raft in a race in the spring carnival, coming up laughing.
What we learned was that Tulloch had been the class president and was also involved in other school activities, and Parker was kind of the class clown. He was into drama. So they could have been any teenager, really.
What's more, there's no proof the boys were in Dartmouth when the Zantops were killed, and no link between their life in Vermont and the ivory towers of Dartmouth College. The trip to Chelsea may have been a waste of time, but when Tim Pfeiffer examines Robert Tulloch's boots, he makes a shocking discovery.
It was determined to be a match, an exact match, based on a number of accidental characteristics in that boot. This is huge. This is the boot that made the footwear impression at the crime scene.
A 17-year-old boy has now been tied to the murder. Police need to know if his friend Parker is involved too.
As well as the boots for comparison. The officers also submitted fingerprint cards of Robert Tulloch and James Parker. We compared these fingerprints to the fingerprint recovered from the back of one of the knife sheaths, and we made matches with James Parker.
The evidence is damning. There can be no doubt. Arrest warrants are immediately issued for the two suspected teenage killers, and police descend on Parker's home.
Mr. Parker, we're here to pick up your son.
But James Parker is gone. Sometime during the night, he took the family car.
There was a note left at the house that said that James had left, that he had to go talk to Robert. Please don't call the police. I think Mr. Parker was perplexed. He certainly doesn't want to believe that his son was involved in something like this.
James Parker, 16, and Robert Tulloch, 17, are on the run. The murder investigation of Hulf and Susanna Zantop is now a manhunt. Robert Tulloch and James Parker, the suspected teenage killers, have both disappeared.
There was a bolo, be on the lookout, put on the vehicle.
Vermont plate.
New Hampshire State Police is involved. The Hanover Police Department is involved. There are in excess of 30 investigators investigating this crime.
Now armed with probable cause, New Hampshire police return to the boys' homes with search warrants.
I remember one of the Vermont investigators looking through a box and actually came across a couple of knives. I still remember her turning to me and saying, "Is this what you're looking for?" And that was quite a moment. I couldn't wait to get on the phone to tell the people back in Hanover that we had the knives.
That night, I have to say, we were all very shocked and still not sure that a 16 or 17-year-old from Chelsea, Vermont, would commit these brutal murders.
48 hours after the teens fled, police get word that Parker's silver Audi has been located.
It was found at a truck stop. I think it was a Massachusetts state trooper who located that.
But the boys are nowhere to be found. They've abandoned the vehicle.
When the car had been found there was a lead that potentially they'd get a ride with a trucker or maybe by bus. Maybe you'd found somebody that they'd been able to hitch a ride with.
Detective White's hunch is right.
They ended up hopping on trucks and going across the country, and it was a serious manhunt, a national manhunt with the FBI involved, all types of law enforcement agencies.
Authorities are searching for two teenage boys from Chelsea, Vermont.
suspects are wanted in the brutal slaying.
4 days into the massive search, Indiana Police Sergeant William Ward learns of the young fugitives.
Their way to California.
On the news, and they mentioned that they were trying to hitchhike to California. That got my attention because Interstate 70, which passes through our county, is one of the main coast-to-coast thoroughfares.
Then Ward's CB radio intercepts a trucker's request.
Any fellows out there want to take a couple of boys out to California?
And my mind was still thinking, what are the odds?
Yeah, this is the cornerback. Listen, both those two boys.
So I just picked up the mic and just said, just drop them off at the truck stop and someone will pick them up. I also knew that would get the boys out of the truck and out in the open where we could find them.
Word to base, word to base.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, listen, I think I got a line on those two runaways here.
Within the hour, the trucker Sergeant Ward talked to arrives at the gas station.
I'm still thinking that these are probably not the boys.
Jim Parker, Robert Tulloch. It's been a long day, boys. Let's go to the cruiser.
They appeared exhausted, tired. A couple young guys had been on the road for a while. They weren't aggressive in any way. They both were very polite. They did not appear menacing in the least. I still was wanting to think that maybe this isn't them. Maybe there's been a mistake here.
But it's no mistake.
These guys are so young, it's kind of hard to imagine them doing something that outrageous.
I think that it just wasn't what anyone expected, but I think it also shows you that you need to always be open to the fact that the perpetrator can be someone that you're not even expecting. We were very relieved that they were caught.
Parker and Tulloch are returned to New Hampshire and charged with the murders of Hulf and Susanna Zantop.
This was very shocking to people and was very unexpected from their friends that we talked to their family. There was no indication that this was going to happen.
Most of us assumed that they were good teenagers and they were protecting somebody else. My assumption was this is just a dreadful mistake. Oh, poor Jimmy and Robert, they're going to have to go through hell for a while till they get cleared.
Both James Parker and Robert Tulloch are charged with first-degree murder, and they're charged with acting in concert with each other.
Media coverage of the arrest leads to a heart-stopping moment of recognition for one man in Vermont.
And there's his face, the individual that knocked on my door, and he's been arrested for murder. It was a very, very bad thing that almost happened that night.
He had a very close call. I mean, they cut the phone lines at his house, and they had planned a place where they were going to bury the bodies.
Damn it, I knew I was right. You see that? I knew I was right. Here's his face.
In preparation for trial, prosecutor Kelly Ayotte interrogates James Parker.
It's very chilling because essentially it's like interviewing the boy next door.
We found this one house.
Even with all the evidence against the pair, she's worried the case won't stick.
The thing that we were missing was we didn't have a story of what happened there. We had some forensic evidence without an explanation as to what happened. There's always a risk that the jury can have the reaction, which I think many people had in the case, which was, oh, come on, how can a 16 and 17-year-old from these good families, why would they kill Hulf and Susanna Zantop?
Ayotte wants a confession. She cuts a deal with Parker to get it.
All the evidence that we have is absolutely clear.
We came to a conclusion that Not only there was an age difference of a year, 17 to 16, but that it was likely that Tulloch was probably the leader of the two. We ended up making a plea agreement with Jim Parker to serve 25 years to life in prison. And in exchange for that, he would testify against Robert Tulloch and give us a complete and full debriefing as to what happened with the murders.
You need to tell me exactly what happened.
The story Parker lays out for the prosecutor is staggering.
That's it.
Well, we were gonna kill somebody, take their credit cards.
James Parker confesses his savage crime to prosecutor Kelly Ayotte. The only motive he offers for killing the Zantops is money.
They had been planning to rob people, to threaten them for their ATM cards, and they were hoping to gain enough money to actually leave Vermont and go to Australia and sort of live off the land.
The boys chose the Zantops neighborhood because it was isolated and seemed wealthy.
The Zantops were random murders. They didn't know Half or Susanna.
Knock on the door. I'll answer the door.
Hi. How's it going? Good. We're here to do a survey for our class.
And they used a ruse to get in the door of, we're conducting an environmental survey. And of course, the irony of the whole thing was that Half was a professor who had an interest in that area.
Just take a chair. Right here? Yeah. Just make yourself.
The medicine walked us over to the study and set up 2 chairs.
They sat right next to him, and Tulloch asked the questions, and Parker was taking notes.
Believe in global warming?
So I thought we were just going through the interview. This guy's alright, we don't need to kill this guy.
Half was somewhat mildly critical of the way they were doing this survey, which of course he would be because it wasn't a real survey.
Do you have any more specific questions you could ask me?
Half suggested that he speak to another friend of his that might help them.
Let me get the number of a friend of mine. I think he can help you out. I have a business card.
And he opened up his wallet to get the phone number for this friend of his.
He opened the wallet, looked through it. It looked like there was a lot of money in there.
Business card here somewhere. Oh, yes, here it is.
And Tulloch pulled out the SOG Seal 2000 knife.
Yeah.
I got one and it was muzzled and jumped at it.
And Susanna Zantop must have heard that there was something going on with her husband.
I have images of Susanna reaching for Half to try and help him.
And Jim Parker grabbed her, and Robert Tulloch ordered him to slit her throat.
Slit her throat, Jim! Jim!
So Robert stopped and we're looking at each other and he said, slit his throat. And paused for a very small amount of time and then slit his throat and let her fall to the floor.
To hear the things that he and Robert Tulloch did to Half and Susanna Zantop, it is very chilling, and it really makes you question how could 16 and 17-year-old boys do that.
Let's get the hell out of here. Let's go.
The young killers reward themselves with the money from Hulf's wallet, $340.
In such a horrific way.
At trial, the court is transfixed by the emotional statement from one of the Zantop daughters.
Rather than focus on the inhumanity, monstrosity, and sheer stupidity of their brutal and senseless deaths, I've tried to console myself by striving to perpetuate the essence of my parents. Two people who embrace true open-heartedness.
On April 5th, 2002, Robert Tulloch pleads guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. He has no hope of parole. James Parker pleads guilty to being an accomplice in the second-degree murder of Susanna Zantop.
I'm sorry.
He is sentenced to 25 years in prison.
None of it really makes any sense. And so you're really left with, at the end of the day, that it's really not clear why they would stab these 2 people to death in such a horrific way.
And we hope that in time, everyone who's been so deeply hurt by this will be able to find peace in their hearts and forgiveness.
And so I think for these parents who, working parents who otherwise seem like a normal household, to have their sons commit these types of murders, I mean, it had to be incredibly shocking to them, and something they could have probably never imagined.
It comes to a point where you say that nothing surprises you anymore. Sometimes it's what one human being can do to another, and brutality-wise, is hard to comprehend, but it happens.
They've thrown their lives away. They're done.
What the hell happened within the 16 or 17 years of their life to that point that made them do such a horrendous act?
Like to have a rational explanation why something like this occurred, and there is none. Tragedy all the way around.